Welcome back, everyone. This is going to be our third clinic. Thanks for everyone stopping by again. Today we're going to do water effects, which are honestly one of the most difficult things to model realistically as far as natural materials go on a model railroad. Just because with a lot of natural materials, you can use natural materials to actually model them. You want to model dirt, you can use real dirt. When you model a rock, you can use a real rock, or you can use a rock as a reference, and foam makes it pretty well. When you make trees, you can use real plants. Water is so dynamic and so variable based on location and water chemistry and even lighting that it's almost impossible to model every single aspect of it realistically, especially in motion. So that being, there are some people that like the look of real water on model railroad. I'm not really a fan of that for a couple reasons. First of all, is it's extremely difficult to seal everything properly. Obviously, if you have real running water on a model railroad, you need to make sure that there are no leaks, even if a pump fails or if something breaks. And you protect all your electronics anywhere remotely close to the water. And obviously, suddenly you have a huge source of humidity. So that will rot all your scenery and might even affect your bench work a little bit. The other thing is, because gravity and physics don't scale, water does not move realistically in HO scale or really many scales at all. Everything's going to move about 100 times faster at scale. So water ripples way too fast, falls way too fast, and just ends up looking kind of toy-like. One exception to that is if you have a garden railroad, real water works really well, because obviously you already have a bunch of stuff that's out of scale. And so if you have a garden railroad and you want to have some water features, that's a good excuse to use it. Otherwise, you have to make some compromises when we're modeling water. Obviously, we can't model the motion, so we kind of have to capture water in a specific place and time, which usually looks fine in photographs, but there's always some compromise when you're looking at it in person. Because of how variable water is, you need different methods to model different aspects of water. I'm going to show you a couple of those today. There are countless ways to model water. I encourage you guys to do your own research after this if you have a specific situation that I don't cover here. But we're going to cover two of the most common situations here. So the first we're going to model two methods today. The first is shallow rivers, streams, ponds, anywhere where there's you can basically see the bottom of the river at some point. For that, you use some sort of epoxy, and then use wave effects, adhesives, etc. to model the ripples. The other is when you want to model an ocean or a bay or some sort of open body of water where you can't really see the bottom. You can't really tell the water's transparent. And for that, we'll use a different method that's also a little bit cheaper. So you actually might be attracted to this if you're modeling any sort of wide open water and you don't want to have to deal with epoxy, because it is kind of a process. All right, so we will start off with epoxy. Today we will be using Envirotex Light 2-part epoxy. This is just one sort of epoxy. This one's nice because it is it's fairly clear, cures relatively fast for an epoxy. It's still 24 hours plus, and it is cost effective relative to other epoxies, but it's still very expensive. That is one of the disadvantages of using resin, is that per volume it's very expensive. This when this was full, it was 32 ounces total. It cost about $35. The river back in Rapidan, if you look at how big that is, that cost about $100 worth of resin to do. So this is very expensive. This is actually the more cost-effective resin, though. Like I said, there is Woodland Scenics makes a product called Realistic Water. It's just a 1-part epoxy in a bottle, but that costs about $27 for a 16-ounce bottle. So $35 for 32 is a pretty good deal. Yep.
So if you're not using the actual Scenic brand water epoxy material, and you use that off-the-shelf epoxy,
Yeah.
do you ever see any yellowing?
Yes, that is one thing I did want to mention. And Envirotex in particular has a reputation for yellowing after several years. You might want to do your research on different brands of epoxy, especially deep pours, that don't have a reputation for doing that. You'll have to do your research. This is just what I have available to me. You can get this at Michael's or Hobby Lobby or any place like that. Anywhere else, you kind of have to look online for chemical supply stores, modeling specialists, things like that. Anywhere that you need a more specialty epoxy. Okay, so the first thing we need to do before we even get started is we need to figure out how much epoxy we need. So I'm going to use this sample we have here. This is just a little stream cutout I made, because obviously if we were to do this all in real time, you would be here for 3 days. So I'm going to do this kind of cooking show style where I do something and then go, here's something I already made. So this is just our little stream bed. I've done a little bit of prep work on this. So you can see I went a little bit ahead of the schedule here and adhered some rocks to the riverbed. We'll get into more how to do that kind of thing when we get into plants, because it's a very similar process. I just need to do it for this step. But all I basically did is took a combination of normal track ballast in gray in various different scales from fine to medium to coarse. And then also talus, which is basically to represent larger rocks. Again, from Woodland Phoenix. It's the same material, just larger chunks. And then used a mix of diluted glue to adhere that to the bottom. And then actually used these just regular driveway gravel to model the bigger rocks. You can also use the foam like I did over here if you want to have a little bit more detail on it. But for most river rocks, just normal rocks actually do a pretty good job. And then after that, I went over with a stain made of brown India ink and water, and just stained most of it, but focusing on the center of the channel, just to give the appearance or the illusion that's a little bit deeper than it actually is once the epoxy's on. I actually took an airbrush and ran the airbrush down the middle of the channel there to even further enhance the depth, make it look like a deeper river. Even though in reality, this epoxy is it's not even half an inch deep. It just adds that appearance of depth without having to spend a fortune on epoxy. Okay, so now that we've done the prep work, we need to figure out what the size of our channel actually is. Easiest way to do that is to take your river and kind of break it up into simple rectangles and triangles and calculate the volume from there. In this case, you can see this is basically just a tilted rectangle. So this is really simple. All we gotta do is measure the length and the width. In this case, it was 6 inches by 2.5 inches. And then you multiply by the depth of whatever your pour is gonna be. In this case, it's going to be about a 1/4 inch pour, and that comes out to 3.5, give or take, cubic inches. And then once that, you have to convert it into fluid ounces, so you can use our crazy American system. If you're doing metric, you're done, because cubic centimeters are equal to milliliters. But in our case, we have to multiply that number by 0.55 to get the number of fluid ounces, which in our case, it comes out to almost exactly 2 fluid ounces of epoxy to get a 1/4 inch pour on this. Okay, so now that we've done the math on that, we need to dam all of the edges of this to make sure that it doesn't leak, because epoxy, it's very deceptive. When you first pour it, it's got a consistency like a very thick syrup. You'd think it would just clog up and gunk everywhere, but that is a lie. It will actually find, like water, any small leak and immediately exploit it. So you have to make sure that you are well sealed up before you start pouring your epoxy. So you can see I've done a couple things here, and I'll demonstrate how to do this one on the other end. But first, on the inside of the bank, if you were following our first clinic, if you remember, I took the Sculptamold and came down into the riverbank and covered up the edge of the foam. That does a lot of the work of sealing up that edge. If you're a little bit skeptical of that, you can do a second step. This is a Woodland Phoenix product called Flex Paste.
Now that's a lot of damage!
Show the camera there. But you can see this is basically like a very, very thick latex paint. And what it does is you paint it very liberally into anywhere you think you might have a gap or crack or a leak, and just fill it up, and it'll seal it right up. You can also use normal, latex caulk to fill up any cracks. And it'll work just as well. This just happens to be a little bit more fluid, so you can cram it into weird spaces. And
Mod Podge works very well.
yes, it does. And then obviously we have to dam up the sides. This is easiest obviously if you have flat edges. So one side, the other side. What we're going to do, I'm going to plug in my hot glue gun here. And this is foam, so it is if I do it at full temperature, it will melt the foam. So I'm just going to plug it in and just test it until it's just barely flowing. And then we'll go ahead and use it. And then you can use any sort of thin material to dam up the ends. You can use foam core, you can use styrene is what a lot of people use. What I discovered actually very recently is that this thin acetate sheet works very well, because once you've got the hot glue in place, when you're pressing the acetate down, you can actually visually see that you've got a continuous seal all the way along the edge of the dam. So you can be absolutely certain that you don't have any leaks visually before you start pouring, which you can't do with a solid sheet of styrene. So that is very helpful. While we're waiting for that to heat up, the question is, well, what if I have multiple terraces of water like I do here, where I'm going to have a waterfall? Obviously, I can't put a dam on an irregular edge or somewhere that the water's going to be pouring over. So what we do in this case, you can see there is actually a dam here. It's just very hard to see. This is clear silicone sealant. It dries perfectly clear. It does take about 24 hours to set up fully before you can start pouring. But you can see, you can barely see that on the edge of the water there. And once you trim it back with a knife, it's basically invisible. Especially in this case, since we're going to have a waterfall going over, ultimately you're not going to see this at all. And on this back edge, we're just going to trim that up with an X-Acto knife, and it will basically be invisible. Very simple. You basically just pull this and squirt bead, and then you make sure it's the height of whatever your pour is going to be. You can do it in stages if you're going to do multiple pours, and then wait for overnight, and it should be good to go. Right, looks like we're good here. So I'm just going to put this on camera. All along the edge here, get a nice big thick bead going all along the edge. Again, this is foam, so I'm gonna make sure this isn't too hot, because it might actually melt through the foam and make even more leaks. So you can see that nice thick bead of hot glue. I'm gonna take our dam here, make sure it fully covers the channel, and then press it down. And like I said, because it's acetate, you can actually see that it's fully sealing up the edge there. All right, so just like that, we're all sealed up. And because it's hot glue, it's basically ready to go immediately. I like to keep the hot glue running when I'm pouring, just in case I missed a leak, so I can immediately go in and seal it up very, very quickly before it gets all over the place, because it will get all over the place if you miss a leak. Okay, but now we've done all of our preparation. It's all nice and sealed up. We are ready to pour. So like I said, we've done our math. We figured out that we need roughly 2 ounces to fill it to the depth we need. You could measure it out with, scales, and what I've done in the past, if you got a big pour, you can just kind of do subsequent pours back and forth between these cups until you get 8 ounces, 14 ounces, whatever you need. But it turns out that plastic shot glass is almost exactly 2 ounces. So we're gonna have a little celebration here. And make sure to read the instructions of whatever. Oh, before I do that, epoxy can be, it's not exactly toxic, but can be a bit of an irritant. So just to set a good example, I'm going to put on rubber gloves.
Also, you got to make sure your surface is level.
Yes, good point. Yes,
the lowest point.
Exactly. It's just like water, just a little bit thicker.
Pick it up and roll it back and forth.
I actually use the kitchen counter at home, because usually your kitchen counters are very, very level. And make sure it's also somewhere that if you do have a leak, you're not over like carpet or something where it's going to be impossible to get out.
Put paper on
Use the paper under this?
I would not, it will leak straight through paper. I would use plastic or foil, because it will just soak through paper just like water. You wouldn't think so, but as it sets, it just passes through everything. All right, so always read the instructions. If you're not using Envirotex, make sure to read the instructions of whatever epoxy you're using very carefully, because they're all a little bit different. Sometimes they're 2 to 1, 3 to 1. Sometimes there's different ratios, mixing times. But in our case, this is very simple. It's just a 1 to 1. So I'm going to use the lines on my cup as a guide here. Again, we want about 2 ounces, so about 1 ounce per cup here. So the first one is hardener. It looks a little bit yellow. It'll turn clear once it sells. Again, like someone mentioned, Envirotex does have a reputation of yellowing over time. So again, another reason you might want to do your research to see if there's another product you might.
Anything exposed to UV is going to yellow.
Yep.
Yes.
So if it's outdoor, if it's exposed
Yeah.
to sunlight, it is going to yellow.
Yeah, but even exposure to like indoor lighting can.
Yeah. Plastic
Has a
hoses
little bit
in
of
the
UVs.
cars, the whole thing.
Yeah, so just be aware of that, depending on your.
UV is not good for scenery.
Not good for much things.
Yeah.
All right. So I've made. Try to get as close to equal parts. Excuse me, as you can. You see 2 parts there. And now before I start mixing, I want to have a little bit of color to this river. Because if I just pour it in, it's going to be perfectly clear. And this water is deep enough that it will have a little bit of a tint. You do not want to use acrylic paints because what will happen there are a couple things. One is that it does not mix properly. You really have to stir it in to get it to fully blend without streaks, and even then you're still going to have a little bit of streaking. And the other thing is if you mix in too much, it will actually, it might cause your cure to fail. And so that's actually what happened the first time we tried to redo the little bay back there. They added too much paint to the mix and it just completely failed. It was just permanently gummy for months. It never really properly cured. It should be like a rock hard finish when you're done. So instead, if you're going to Michael's to get your resin, right next to it there are these resin dyes. These ones have to come in a kit. So there were multiple different shades of blues and greens. And these are made specifically for resin that will dissolve right into it, and they are very concentrated. So you should only need a couple drops for an ounce like this. Depending on the effect you're going for, you might want to have a really deeply colored river. Although in that case, I might do multiple pours and have subsequently less color in each pour, so you can have kind of an illusion of depth. I'm going to start with just a couple drops.
Maybe.
You can see that dissolves right in. We're just going to give it a quick mix. I can already tell I'm going to need more. And because you're only mixing it into 1/2 at a time, get to the color you want and then double it. Because obviously you're going to be diluting it by half. So you need to be able to make sure you got enough. And then another thing is when you're mixing your color, obviously when you're looking at it, you're seeing the color is going to be at like 2 inches deep, when really it's only going to be 1/4 inch deep. So before you decide what color you want, take your mixing stick and stick it down to about the depth that your finished river is going to be to get an idea of what the actual color will be once you pour it. So I'm going to I put in 4 drops. I'm going to put in 4 more drops of this kind of blue-green color. And as far as what color you choose, that's a little bit of a personal choice, depending on what you're trying to model. Because obviously water can be all sorts of different colors in rivers. If you're out west, it can be almost clear. Sometimes it'll be actually a little bit blue from like glacier ice. If you toward the east, more faster moving rivers, they can be almost a black or like a green color. And then slow moving rivers, they tend to be almost brown. So really you just need to kind of look at pictures and see what you're looking for, and eventually, if you're freelancing, you might just want to make an artistic choice and just kind of decide, I want it to look this color, and no one can stop you. So, and I'm actually going to put in a couple drops. This is Woodland Scenic's murky color. I'm going to put in a couple drops of that. So you can see, again, that looks pretty strongly colored, but again, we're going to dilute it by about half when we start mixing. So that's probably about right. So now we're ready to mix the way that the instructions recommend you do it, and the way I like it seems to work pretty well, so I follow it. You take your 2 halves, pour 1 cup into the other cup, and then pour it back. And that just makes sure everything is well incorporated before you even start mixing. And now the fun part, the critical thing with epoxy is that it has to be very, very thoroughly mixed in order to cure properly. If there's any sort of separation, it will not cure properly. Like I said, it'll kind of be more of a gummy texture just forever. And so now the fun part is we have to stir. And we're going to stir for about 5 minutes, and that's regardless of how much you're making
It's
it.
sort of gummy.
Yeah, so we're going to sit here. Luckily, I have some notes here, so I can still talk while we're mixing. Let's see. We're at...
5 minutes? Oh.
Could someone start a timer for me, or at least keep an eye on the clock? It doesn't need to be exactly 5 minutes, but because we have some play time. Your working time once you're done mixing is going to be about 10 minutes. The way epoxy works is that there are 3 things that affect how well it's going to cure. That is the depth of the pour, the temperature of the room, and the humidity of the room. The hotter it is inside the room, the faster it's going to cure. It's a direct relationship there. Inversely, if the room is too high humidity, or if you're doing it outside or something where it's high humidity, it will, again, the cure might fail. It'll just be too gummy and it won't ever properly harden up. So you want to make sure that you're doing it inside somewhere that's got some proper climate control, air conditioning. You don't want to do this in your garage with the door open. But at the same time, you want some ventilation because it can make some fumes if you're not careful. It's not too noxious, but it can stink up a room for a little bit. Then the most important thing is pour depth. The more you pour at once, as it cures, it generates heat. And as it generates heat, it cures faster. And as it cures faster, it generates more heat. So if you pour too much at once, you risk having a runaway effect where it gets super, super hot. Even with normal pour, you can actually put your hand over the water, or the epoxy rather, and feel the heat coming off of it. The limit for what I found for Envirotex is about half an inch. A quarter of an inch. If you pour much more than that, it will heat up to the point where it will actually melt the foam it's sitting on. If you want to see the example of that, if you actually look very carefully at the river in Rapidan behind the dam there, under the bridge, you'll see it's a little bit bubbly, and the water actually doesn't come all the way up to the bridge. What happened there is I miscalculated how much epoxy I would need. I poured a half-inch pour. And within about an hour, it had gotten hot enough to the point where it melted the foam. It was starting to release gases inside the epoxy, and it actually created leaks along the side because it melted through the foam. Luckily, because as it heated up, the cure time also rapidly sped up. By the time I noticed that it was leaking, it actually almost completely hardened. So if you actually look at it from the top, you can tell there's a big, ugly bubble in it. And again, it hardened in a way that there's actually like a rounded edge on the edge. But because it hardened up so fast and because you're looking at it at an angle, you actually can't tell from the viewing angle that it's at. But if you actually go in there and look careful, if you stand over it, you will see there's a big air bubble underneath the epoxy where the foam melted through. If you need a pour deeper than a quarter of an inch, say you've got a scene where you're looking at the edge of a river and you want to see like fish going through it, or like the bottom half of a boat, and you want it to be a more realistic depth for a deep river, that's another case where you're going to want to look for an alternative epoxy to Envirotex, because they do make deep pour epoxies. They usually only sell them in bulk sizes, like a gallon each hardener and epoxy, and they can run easily couple $100.
Like I said, they just do it in layers also.
Yep, that's the other alternative. Just do multiple pours. You don't have to wait for the full curing time. If you're doing a quarter-inch pour at a time, you can usually wait a couple hours in between pours, and you'll get it there eventually. And that's actually a good method to approximate depth and get some cool effects. Because if you actually look at the edge of this module, if you look really, you can come up or pass this around. If you look really close at the edge of the river, it's actually 2 different pours. The first is a much more darkly tinted green, just to give that illusion of depth, to make it look a lot deeper than it really is, give it that tint. And then the layer on top of that, about the same depth, is perfectly clear. So that all the shoreline and all the areas, like the top of the rock, that is closer to the surface, it looks like it's in clear water, and then it gets murkier and murkier as you go down. And you could actually do 3 different pours, like have one that's almost opaque right along the bottom of the river, especially if you have a little bit of a bowl shape rather than flat, and then have a slightly more translucent, and then a clear one, and so you could get a really cool effect that way. So we've got our epoxy here. Just gonna scrape that off, and very simple. All I'm gonna do, get on the center here, and we're just gonna very slowly pour it in. And you kind of want to aim toward the center, but you also want to get some coverage, because if you just pour it all in the center, what it's going to do is it's going to go very, very high, overwhelm everything, and then sink back down. So you'll get like shininess on the tops of rocks where there's not going to be, where it would be dry in real life. So you kind of want to spread it out. Just be very gentle with it. I'm going to come up to the shore, but I'm not going to go over it, because once you get the epoxy on something, it's not coming off. If it's dirt, you can cover it up. But if it's like a rock or a boat or like a pier, you're screwed. So be very careful about how you pour this. All right, look at that. Perfect. All right. So as this cures, so there's already some bubbles mixed in here from when we were doing our mixing. A lot of that's going to rise back to the surface naturally and pop, but then as it cures, it's going to release some gases, and those are going to try to rise to the surface. You obviously don't want those. So a little trick, when you got bubbles on the surface like this, there's a couple things you can do. You can use a, make sure we're in frame here. You can use a soldering torch to kind of very carefully, especially if you got a foam base, very carefully just brush really rapidly over the surface and pop the bubbles. Or carbon dioxide will also pop them. So you got a lot of carbon dioxide in your lungs, so if you just breathe around the top, you'll see it'll just make a wave of popping bubbles. And it almost looks like a soda. There we go. And just like that, you can see perfectly clear. No bubbles at all. There's going to be a few bubbles that form as it hardens up. But you can just keep going over there. And again, a lot of them are going to rise to the surface anyway. And if you have one or two bubbles, once you add the water effects, you're really not going to notice. And so that's that. You let this sit. It takes about 2 hours for a 1/4 inch pour before you can pour the next layer. After about 7 to 10 hours, it'll have kind of a rubbery consistency where it'll hold its own shape. It's solid, but it's soft enough that you can trim it up. So at that point, you can pull the dams off, and as epoxy hardens, it kind of contracts, and so there's going to be a little bit of a meniscus on the edges. So what you can do there, after about 7 hours, you pull the dams off, take an X-Acto knife, and trim it off really easily. Once it hardens, it's really rock hard, and you'll have to chisel it off, and you risk actually chipping it or cracking it. So right in that middle stage is when you want to clean it up. And then it takes about 24 hours to fully cure before you're ready to do anything else with it. Now that you've poured your epoxy, if you're just doing it like a stagnant pond or a puddle, you're done. The thing is, any body of water larger than a puddle is going to have some sort of movement on it. So we need to somehow simulate that. So what we're going to do is we're going to use some surface treatments to add ripples. Now, one thing to note, what sort of just an order of operations thing when you're doing epoxy water, you're not going to be doing it all at once. Because if you look at this module here, now I can actually bring this forward, you can see where I poured the epoxy, it sort of, through capillary action, let me get this on the camera here too, seeped up into the sides of the dirt here. And if you had any plants there or anything like that, it would do the exact same thing. It would creep up into there, and you'd have this dark tide mark here. If you're modeling a beach, that might be fine. But generally anywhere where there isn't a lot of tide action, you want the color to be consistent all the way up to the side of the river. So what you want to do is pour your epoxy, wait for it to fully cure, and then you want to go back with the same dirt material that you used before and clean up that edge. Now the problem with that is you obviously don't want to get dirt all over your river. Luckily, there is a very easy solution to that. It's also pretty fun. So what we're going to use to do our water effects is this. This is Mod Podge Gloss. It's basically like a white glue that dries very, very, very glossy, almost as glossy as the epoxy itself, and it dries completely transparent. But it's also extremely flexible, so you can actually also use this as a liquid mask. And so that's what I've done here. I've actually painted on a pretty thick layer, probably about 1/16 of an inch on average, of the Mod Podge all over the surface of this river, up to the edges of the shore. You don't want to touch it because then you actually risk pulling stuff up, but getting as close as I possibly can. And that, like I said, creates a mask so you can go back, do all of your groundwork. You can even start putting in plants and things like that, because you obviously don't want leaves going into on top of your epoxy either. Do everything up on the shore, and then once you're ready to go back and do your wave effects, if you like peeling the little bits of plastic off a new electronic device when you buy it, you're going to love this part. But you just get underneath here, see if we can get started. There we go. There it is, and you can see this is all going to come up. It's one complete sheet. This is so satisfying. This is the most satisfying part of doing it.
What's appealing?
Right, you can leave.
You're done.
There you go. So now you can see, perfectly clear, perfectly set. And so now we're ready to do our wave effects, which with, ironically, the exact same material, just used in a slightly different way. So we're going to do actually 3 different types of effects here. So this is going to be a fairly gently moving river at the base. So we're going to start with just a sort of basic ripple effect all over the surface of it. Then wherever there's going to be some wave action, with some, like, not quite white water, but just some more intense movement, we're going to go over with Woodland Scenics water effects or acrylic medium gloss gel. You find this with the rest of the paints at an art supply store. I'm pretty well convinced that this and this are the exact same product, just repackaged. So you can use either. This is just more convenient for using a brush. And I'm not sure how the costs line up. I'm pretty sure they're comparable. So you could use either or, depending on what's available to you. And then we're also going to use the same product for doing our waterfall here with a little different treatment. That's what this is going to be, but I'll demonstrate that in just a moment. Okay, but we're going to start with the ripples. Get our paintbrush. Crack open, again, Mod Podge gloss. There is a matte version as well. Make sure you don't accidentally use that. The matte has a yellow label. Mod Podge gloss is red. So make sure you use the red label Mod Podge. We're just going to dip our brush in. We're just going to go full strength. And we're just going to brush it right onto the surface of the water. We're going to go pretty thin with this application. And we're going to do this in stages because it does dry pretty fast. So we're going to put on a little patch. We're going to do the magic trick, and then we're going to move on to the next section. So that's about right. You want a pretty thin coat. If you go too thick, you risk trapping a bunch of air bubbles, which looks bad and affects the opacity. But that's about right here. You can see just a very thin layer. And now to get the actual ripple effect, there's a couple methods. There's a low-tech method, which is you literally just take a straw from Burger King or whatever, and you blow ripples onto the surface of the water. It takes a long time, and even for a small river, I did that for a module about this length, a river about this wide. I felt like I was about to pass out when I was done. So if you have access to it, a better method is an airbrush. All you do is you start at the nearest edge and you just get in close and you start blowing ripple patterns into the surface there. Starting at one edge and working forward. And this will make really natural looking ripples. And you kind of want to make sure it's spread out as thinly as possible, again, so it dries kind of evenly. You don't want big clumps. All right. And again, it's still drying up, but you can already tell on the upper half of the river where it's starting to dry. Look at that texture there, especially as I bring it in and out of the light. A nice subtle effect. Looks really nice. Now, We're going to want some more intense, like I said, a little more intense motion around the edges of the rock here. So we're going to go, I'm going to use the, I'm just going to use the water effects. Because again, I'm pretty sure
Take
that...
a hair dryer.
You could, yeah, if you're in...
Will that speed up and dry?
It would, yeah. Again, it doesn't take very long, but if you're in a real hurry, yeah, it would work. Just have to be careful if you've got a foam base, make sure you don't melt it. Take our gloss medium. You can see it's kind of a thick paste. And we're going to put a little bit on our brush. And try to remember which way the water is flowing. Obviously, since we have our waterfall over here, the water is going to be going down toward the edge, forward edge of the module. So I'm going to start building it up on the back edge of this rock and move around it like this. I'll start by building up a little pile, and then with your brush kind of stipple it and then stretch it out around. And you kind of want to go overboard with this because this does contract as it dries, and it dries clear. So you want to kind of start heavier than you think you might need to, and then bring it out. You can see there, kind of got a nice big pile of water building up on one side of the rock. And again, this will also clean up with water if you go a little bit too far, or if you make a spill. Just stipple that out and fade it out into the rest of the water. And just kind of get it a little bit stippled to get a little more texture. And then once that dries, again, it'll dry clear. If you want to have a little bit more of a white water effect, just take a dry brush, take some normal white paint, and dry brush to the top of the water effect. Just fine. All right, now, last thing is the waterfall here. This is a little bit different. Instead of applying the water effects directly to the river, we're going to apply it to another thin sheet of acetate here. We're going to measure out the size of our waterfall. So we're going to be about that wide. And it looks like we're about an inch deep. It doesn't have to be exact because you can always cut it down. So I'm just going to roughly draw out the shape of my waterfall there. And then I'm actually going to take the water effects for this because it's a little bit easier in this case to have it as a squeezable bead. I'm just going to squeeze a thin bead on the top. And then we're just going to start at the top and pull down. Just like water running from the top of a cliff down to the bottom. Just like that. Want it a little bit thicker at the top because that's where you're going to kind of adhere it to the top of the cliff, but basically just pull down one continuous motion. You want to make sure you go continuous from the top to the bottom. You don't want to have a stop in the middle of the waterfall, but if you do, just go back and from the top and go straight back over it again, and it'll smooth out. Here's one I made earlier. It's still curing a little bit, but mostly it's just a transparent sheet. So we're just going to pull this right off like that. I'm going to test fit it. And you can actually see that's just about perfect. So I'm going to take this water effects again. Put a bead of it right on the top here.
Did you use that cellophane packing tape that when you got to use it, put it back up?
You could, yeah. This stuff is actually sticky enough that you really don't need it.
Oh.
Like I actually had to make sure to pull it up carefully to make sure it didn't rip, because it'll glue itself onto basically anything once you can see. And then just make it look like the water's sort of careening over the edge there. And it's the same thing I was saying with the with this effect here. You want to, once this is set up, you want to go back with a dry brush and coat that up. Now, one thing, this is obviously a pretty short waterfall, so it doesn't throw very far. If you have a taller waterfall where it would actually arc over the edge and miss the rock entirely, you can actually keep this cellophane on and fully glue this edge down and then pull that straight down. So it'll actually, you keep this as the backing and it will make an arc. And because it's transparent, you won't see it. So if you want to have a more dramatic waterfall effect. And then obviously the last thing we gotta do is whenever there's a waterfall, it foams up at the bottom. So I'm actually going to take, you could use polyfiber, but I found polyfiber is a little bit too dense. So what this is aquarium filter floss. You can buy this at Petco. It's really cheap. It's like $5 to $10. I'm just going to take a little strip of it and I just kind of tease it out with my hand, make sure it's not straight. Squeeze more. Pretty thick here because we're going to try to encase the floss in it. Go out from there, just to start with. I'm going to embed the floss in there and kind of tack it in. This is a little bit messy part, but be patient and eventually got a nice little foam effect right at the base of our waterfall there. You can use this if you've got like a whitewater where it's not quite a waterfall, but you've got like a rapid that's you need some whitewater effects. So you can use this exact same method.
That glue is going to dry clear, right?
Exactly. So if you want to make it look a little bit more whitewater, you will have to go back with the dry. I'm assuming everyone's familiar with the dry brushing. Just in case you're not, what that basically is you put a paint color on your brush, and then you take a paper towel, you wipe most of it off until there's just barely any color on it, and you just barely brush over the top of the texture. That way just the high points of whatever you're painting get just a little bit of color. And by building that up, you get this really nice textured look where it looks like just the top of the foam is got air bubbles trapped in it, so you get that sort of realistic water effect.
Doing the water, they'll brush in the direction of the water.
Yes. Yep. All right, so this is obviously not what it's going to look like, but you can already see the ripples are set up. You can kind of see we've gone from a flat, perfectly glossy river to something that looks like it's got some motion. The obvious disadvantage of this is cost. Epoxy is pretty expensive. So what if you have a body of water where you can't even see the bottom? You've got a harbor, like after the presentation, you can walk up over here and see you've got a large river, you've got an ocean where you can't actually see the bottom of the river, so it would just be a waste. In that case, there is a second method that looks very good and is extremely cost effective. If that costs about $30 to $40 in materials. It's not exactly $30 to $40 because you got enough to make multiple rivers, but your initial investment is $30 to $40. This method costs about $10 to $15, and covers a pretty large area. Hey, late night editing cutter here. How you doing? I throw out a lot of ballpark numbers here that aren't really helpful in comparing costs. So I went back and did the math on how much each of these methods actually costs to give you an idea of how far your money goes one way or the other. Here's the numbers. I set the sizes based on how much you need to buy to work on a room-sized layout, assuming you have to buy everything from scratch. $63 in materials for the epoxy method and $42 for the toilet paper. So at first glance, modeling with epoxy is 50% more expensive than using paper. But that's not the whole story. Let's look at how far each purchase goes. How much coverage you get from epoxy depends on how deep your pour is, but let's say a 1/4 inch for this example, which is pretty typical. 32 ounces will cover 1.5 square feet. That's $42 per square foot. With the paper method, it's the varnish that's the limiting factor. How much you get out of it depends on how many coats you decide to use, but in my experience, a half pint can cover about 5 square feet. That's less than $9 per square foot. That's 4.5 times cheaper than epoxy, and that's giving epoxy an advantage. A quart of varnish is 4 times the volume and covers 20 square feet, but it's only twice as expensive as a half pint. Even with the cost of more glue to cover the extra area, that brings the cost down to $3 a square foot. And there's one more thing to consider. Most of these items are only useful for modeling water. Mod Podge gloss is an exception. You can use it as a liquid mask for painting, among other things. What about the other side? Well, I'm hoping you already have toilet paper somewhere in your house. White glue we use literally all the time, same for acrylic paint, though maybe not all of the colors you need for this project. The only product that's hard to find another use for is the varnish. So all of this stuff sits on your shelves forever. Most of this stuff will get used eventually. Okay, that's it. Hopefully that's a more helpful comparison. Let's get back to the video. So all it is, all you need your substrate. You need white glue. You need toilet paper is the magic ingredient. Yes, believe it or not.
1 ply or 2 ply?
Does not matter. The cheapest you can find. The reason for that is the more expensive toilet papers have like the fancy patterns with like the leaves and the quilted stuff. You didn't have to work that out. If you just get the really cheap stuff, you don't have to worry about that. So get this cheap. I bought this roll at Rite Aid for $1. That's all you need. In addition to that, you do need to color the surface. So we're going to need some acrylic paint. I got some basic colors here. Basically what you need is green, white, black, and brown. We're going to need our gloss again. And you need an acrylic varnish. Acrylic's important because we're using acrylic paints and we're also going to be sealing it with Mod Podge. If you use an oil-based gloss, while it is more glossy, there's a chance it could react to everything and cause it to melt. This is a multi-stage process. The caveat is this is a little bit more labor intensive and takes a little bit more waiting than the epoxy, but not by much. So I've already done some prep work here. First thing you do is you take your substrate, in this case foam, you put down a full strength layer of white glue, and then you put, in this case, 2 layers of single ply or 1 layer of 2 ply as your base coat. And then you let that sit for about an hour to act as your base layer. Now, what we're going to do now is we're basically going to make kind of a paper mache. We're going to build up a thick coat of multiple layers of toilet paper. It's thick enough that we can start manipulating it without tearing through the paper. So I'm going to take, this is our standard 70-30 scenic glue mix. Just going to pour that in. Too much, but I can always pour it back. I'm taking a normal paintbrush. I'm on camera here. Yep, I'm going to get that out of the way. Perfect. And then starting with, again, 2 layers. First time I did it 1 layer by 1 layer, but you need about 8 to 10 layers for it to be really effective. So I'm just going to fold it over. Paint on. Some glue. Lay down. And brush over it. Kind of building up, again, almost like a paper mache. Lots of layers. And again, we're looking at about 8 to 10 layers total, so you don't have to get it perfectly adhered at the bottom because, again, you're going to be stacking this up. So the one thing you want to make sure is don't overlap the edges because then you'll make a bump. That'll be kind of obvious. So you want to make sure when you're laying down each layer that they're pretty close to just edge on edge. The more height and dynamic you want in your waves, the more toilet paper you're going to need, but that's going to be sort of a judgment call. I don't do super huge waves with this. We're going to end up with an HO scale waves about a foot or 2 tall. If you want taller, again, more toilet paper. But another option is one thing I've seen in the naval modeling world, people who do waterline hull models of ships, is they use aluminum foil and paint it to get really high waves and really like crisp peaks and things like that. And so while I haven't tried it myself, one thing that might be worth experimenting with is using the aluminum foil to get really dramatic height as your base layer and then layer the toilet paper on top of that. So you get really high base waves and then you got more subtle waves on top of that. I think that could be really cool if you're trying to model like a really stormy harbor or something like that. So here's what it looks like before we've even done anything to it. So you can already see kind of naturally just from how it wrinkled up, we've got some cool sort of ripple effects on the top. But obviously, ocean water has waves. And so what we're gonna do is, starting at one edge, I'm going to push my brush in a direction, try to start building waves.
Use kind of a dry brush there, you don't want
Damp. Actually, it works a little bit better if it's damp.
Oh, okay.
It really doesn't matter actually. But so you can see sort of pushing that up. If you're working toward a beach or something, they tend to be a little bit arced. But so just kind of pushing up. Going from one side. This is why you want plenty of layers, because you can see as I toward the back side of the wave, it gets a little bit thinner. So you want to make sure you have enough depth to work with, that you're not accidentally tearing through. You can see that's actually a pretty big wave. I'm kind of teasing it back out toward the back there. So generally how waves work is that the front is pretty sharp and then it eases off toward the back. So I'm going to push up on one side and pull back on the other. Push up on the back. Just build it up and push toward the front. And there's not really an edge to this. You kind of just, it's going to end up looking good no matter what, honestly. So I'm just going to have one more. They're about equally spaced because generally waves, they come in a pretty regular pattern. So, and the bigger the wave, generally, the farther apart they are. So just keep that in mind. All right. You can see there, kind of molded in some wave patterns, and now you're going to let this sit aside overnight. It does take a while to dry. Look, here's one I already made. So you can see here, that's what you end up with. Some cool water effects. Honestly, I kind of think it looks like snow, so you might be able to play with this kind of some snowbank effects. But now we have that, we need to color it. So what we're going to do is we're going to pretend that we're up against the shore. So we're going to say that this edge is our shoreline. So the water there is going to be a little bit lighter and a little bit murkier. And then as we work back, it's going to get darker and darker, actually going to get nearly black. So I'm going to use this as a palette since it's available. We're going to start, again, 4 colors: brown, green, black, white. You will notice a conspicuous absence of blue. You can actually make more realistic water if you don't use blue, surprisingly enough. The exception is if you're modeling somewhere. I was out in Chicago a couple of years ago, and I was amazed how blue Lake Michigan is. So if you have like a freshwater lake or something that's big enough to have wave action, that might be a good excuse to use blue. But otherwise, green actually usually ends up looking more realistic. This is, in particular, this is phthalo green. It's got a little bit of blue in it. It's closer to a teal than a green, but it's still green.
Color of blue out of water is a reflection in the sun.
Sun and clouds. Lack of clouds.
Yep, there are some places where it actually is blue. Like if it's got glacier melt, that tends to look a bit more blue. But ocean water, because of algae, tends to be a lot more green. So I'm gonna use this as my palette. I'm gonna get a little bit of green. You don't need a ton in this case. A little bit of black. Just need a little bit more. A little bit of white. And by the way, just a quick note, I am using mostly artist acrylics here instead of this craft paint. The craft paint will work. Obviously, it's cheaper, but the thing about it is that the pigment is less intense. So if you're using it for mixing or for painting, it tends to be, it doesn't seem to go as far. So I'll use, even though I'm mixing about the same like ratios, I end up using twice as much brown in this craft paint than the artist acrylics. So if you can get the artist acrylics for this kind of stuff, do. So starting at the edge here, I'm going to do it in steps. So I'm going to go shore, a little bit farther back, a little bit farther back, and then deep ocean. So I'm going to start brown. I'm going to get some white, and I'm going to get some green. And the green's pretty intense, so I don't want too much. All right. If I can use a little bit more brown there. And this is, you might want to look at pictures for reference for this, but honestly, this is where more artistic vision comes into play. And just kind of mess with it until you got a color that you think is about right. So this is looking pretty good. Kind of a murky lighter green. So I'm gonna load up my brush. Make sure that your brush is kind of wet so it spreads out. I'm gonna start at the edge here. Just brush that on. You see kind of a light green, almost an emerald color, a jade color rather. And go about, it's going to depend on how shallow the water is where you're trying to model, but I'm going to go about an inch and a half back. And then starting right from where the mix I already have, I'm going to add a little bit of black, a little bit more green. So that's kind of our next stage. Again, kind of just playing with it, using the brown that we already have in there. So then, show on camera here, okay. See this one. And this is going to look pretty stark between stages at first, but we're going to do a blending step that's going to bring it all together. And again, about inch and a half. No real magic to it, just kind of play with it, see what might work best. I'm going to try to start a little bit of blending here, but we're going to go back and blend it a little bit further later. So that'll bring me about to the halfway mark. And again, a little bit more black. At this point, it's going to be about a 50-50 mix of black and green. Go pretty dark. A little more green there. Again, no magic. No real formula I can give you, unfortunately. Just going to have to use your imagination a little bit. In fact, I'm going to test this, see. That's a little bit dark, so I'm going to go a little bit more green. A little bit of brush. There we go. You want to go pretty thick on your application here. You don't want to, it's not going to dry on you since you're putting on a pretty thick layer, but you do want to make sure that you have enough to mix up. You don't worry about there being white spots. We're going to go back and fade those back in. And then our final stage is going to be almost entirely black, with just a little touch of green in there. And it's going to look like that's pretty scary the first time you get, like, water's not black, but actually when you look at it, it's pretty close. It's pretty close to black. So you can see this is just barely green. It's mostly black. Just gonna load up the brush. A little bit more here. So green. And it's okay if it's a little bit splotchy, because guess what? Real water is a little bit splotchy. And you actually make it look more realistic in some cases, make it look like there's something under the water that's a little bit shallower than the surrounding, like a sandbar or a shipwreck or some sort of rock just underneath the surface that's making the water a little bit lighter in that location. Adds a little bit of interest. Okay, so now we've got our really stark gradations here. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to rinse off the brush. Make sure there's almost no color in it. And in fact, if you've got another brush, it's a good idea to actually use that instead. Keep that in a completely separate jar and just use that for blending instead. But I'm just going to load it up with just water. And then I'm going to start blending in between stages here. You can already see there, sort of transitioning there. And we're going to rinse it off a little bit, making a mess. That's the fun part. Going from one side to the other. Rinse it off. You can see this is also helping covering all those white spots. Start pulling in. And I'm actually going to do a pull one side all the way down to the other. It'll darken one side, lighten up the other. That might be, you can see it kind of messed up there a little bit, but honestly, adds a little bit of interest there. But I can just smooth that out. I'm working top to bottom. And there we go. You can see now, you have a nice smooth transition from the shallow end to the deep side. It makes it really look like the water's sloping down from the shore into the depths there. Now, this is going to dry flat, so once it's dried up, now that we've wetted it, it's going to take a couple hours for it to really dry before we can do this step. but you're gonna go over it with, again, this gloss stuff. And that just does a couple things, makes it glossy, and it adds a little bit of depth to the water, just a little tiny bit of thickness to it, so that it doesn't look like a flat surface so much. And if you want to, you could stop right there. That looks pretty good. But there is a couple things, like the waves are really, really sharp, and it still looks a little bit flat. So we're going to do one last final step for this to really pop. So once your Mod Podge is set, it doesn't take very long. It takes, again, about, with the thin layer you're putting on, no more than an hour. We're going to go to our polyacrylic here, our acrylic varnish. Again, make sure it's high gloss and super simple. Make sure our brush is clean. In fact, I'm going to use a different brush. Let's be safe. Yeah. I'm going to dip it into the varnish here and just brush a thin, even coat all over the whole thing. And this one jar, this is about a $10 jar. It will cover an area about 2 feet by 3 feet, ultimately. Because, all right, so I've just put on my coat. I'm going to put on a little bit more just to make sure everything. You want to put on enough that there's a full even coat everywhere, but you don't want it to pool too much. So just again, a nice even coat.
Now, because these waves aren't big waves, you wouldn't dry brush any of those. Just to have them stick a little bit. And you just
generally.
wait for your sunlight or your
pretty much.
indoor light.
So you do the same thing I was demonstrating with that, where once it's dry, if you've got some like particularly high breakers, you can dry brush a little bit of white on the top of those. Or if you have boat wake. So one thing I forgot to mention with this, if you have a boat or a rock or a piling, go ahead and stick that onto your paper while it's still wet and mold the wake lines around it, both in front for the bow wave and behind it for the prop wake.
The V,
and it ends up looking pretty good. Once we're done here, you can walk up behind there to look at the tugboat and see how well it looks. Now we're not done here. That was just the first layer. You want to do this about 5 or 6 times. You let it dry for about half an hour, just until the whiteness disappears, and then you do it again. What that's going to do, it's going to build up layer by layer more of that depth, sort of round out the more harsh waves. And so finally, what you end up with, and you can pass this around, this is the final product. You can see that the waves are kind of rounded off, and it's got this really nice, almost translucent effect, and it's super, super glossy. So it makes a really, really convincing ocean effect for not much money. And that is everything. So now you know how to make both river effects for shallow water and deeper water for your harbors and oceans. And that's about it. Any questions?
Very good. Very good.
Thank you.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys for all coming by. Thank you guys.